Contradictions in Genesis. The contradictions found in Genesis. The order of creation. In Genesis 1, God creates the animals before creating humans, but in Genesis 2, God creates Adam before the animals. The length of creation. In Genesis 1, the creation of the world takes 6 days, but in Genesis 2, it appears to happen in 1 day. The creation of man and woman. In Genesis 1, God creates both man and woman at the same time, but in Genesis 2, God creates Adam first, then creates Eve from his rib. The age of Adam. In Genesis 5, it says that Adam lived to be 930 years old, but in Genesis 3, God said that Adam would die the day he ate from the tree of knowledge. The number of animals on the ark. In Genesis 6, God commands Noah to take 2 of every kind of animal on the ark, but in Genesis 7, it says that some animals were taken in 7 by 7. These are some of the contradictions found in Genesis, but it is important to note that the Bible is not a scientific or historical document, but rather a collection of stories and teachings meant to convey spiritual truths and moral lessons. Contradictions in Exodus. There are several contradictions found in the book of Exodus in the Bible. Some of them include the number of Israelites who left Egypt. In Exodus 12:37, it is written that 600,000 men, besides women and children, left Egypt. However, in Exodus 38:26, the number of men is given as only 603,550. The timing of the Exodus. The Bible does not give a clear date or timeline for the Exodus. Some scholars place it around 1446 BCE, while others suggest it may have occurred much earlier or later. The plagues of Egypt. There are discrepancies in the order and nature of the plagues that struck Egypt. For example, in Exodus 7:17-21, the first plague is turning the Nile into blood, while in Exodus 8:1-6, the first plague is frogs. The location of Mount Sinai. The Bible does not provide a clear description of the location of Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Some scholars suggest it may have been in the Sinai Peninsula, while others suggest it may have been in Saudi Arabia. The age of Moses. In Exodus 7:7, it is written that Moses was 80 years old when he spoke to Pharaoh, while in Deuteronomy 34:7, it is written that Moses was 120 years old when he died. Contradictions in Leviticus. As an AI language model, I don't have any personal beliefs about religion or morality. However, here are some of the contradictions found in Leviticus. Leviticus 11:6-8 states that hares and rabbits are unclean and should not be eaten, but Deuteronomy 14:7 lists them as clean and permissible to consume. Leviticus 11:13-19 prohibits eating birds of prey, while Deuteronomy 14:11-18 permits the consumption of certain birds of prey. Leviticus 11:20-23 prohibits the consumption of insects that walk on all fours, but verses 41-42 permit the consumption of certain types of winged insects. Leviticus 19:19 forbids the breeding of 2 different kinds of animals, yet Deuteronomy 22:9-11 permits the planting of 2 different crops in the same field. Leviticus 20:10 commands that adulterers be put to death, yet King David, who committed adultery with Bathsheba, was not put to death. These contradictions have been debated and interpreted in different ways by scholars and religious leaders. Contradictions in the Book of Numbers. Contradictions that some scholars have identified in the Book of Numbers. The number of Israelites in the census is inconsistent. In Numbers 146, the total number of Israelites is given as 603,550, while in Numbers 26:51, the total is given as 601,730. The age of Moses is inconsistent. In Numbers 33:38, Moses is said to be 120 years old when he dies, but in Deuteronomy 34:7, he is said to be 120 years old when his eyesight begins to fail. The number of Levites is inconsistent. In Numbers 3:39, the number of Levites is given as 22,000, but in Numbers 26:62, the number is given as 23,000. The order of events is inconsistent. In Numbers 21-13, Moses strikes the rock to bring forth water, but in Numbers 27:14-17, God tells Moses to speak to the rock to bring forth water. The length of the Israelites' stay in the wilderness is inconsistent. In Numbers 10:11, the Israelites leave Sinai and arrive at Kadesh Barnea in the 2nd year of their journey, but in Deuteronomy 1:2, they arrive at Kadesh Barnea in the 40th year. The number of sacrifices required is inconsistent. In Numbers 7, the number of animals sacrificed by each tribe is the same, but in Numbers 28-29, the number of sacrifices required varies according to the day of the week and the time of year. The character of God is inconsistent. In Numbers 14:18, God is described as slow to anger and forgiving, but in Numbers 16:32-33, God causes the ground to open up and swallow Korah and his followers. It is important to note that some of these apparent contradictions may be due to differences in writing styles or editorial decisions, rather than actual inconsistencies in the text. Contradictions in the Book of Malachi. Some contradictions that scholars and theologians have found in the Book of Malachi. The identity of the messenger. In Malachi 3:1, the messenger who prepares the way for the Lord is said to be Elijah. However, in Matthew 11:14 and 17:10-13, Jesus identifies John the Baptist as the fulfillment of this prophecy. The timing of the coming of the Lord. Malachi 3:1-2 suggests that the Lord will come suddenly to his temple, but Malachi 4:5 suggests that Elijah will come first to prepare the way. This raises the question of whether Elijah's coming is before or after the Lord's coming. The question of tithing. Malachi 3:8-10 tells the people to bring tithes to the temple, but Malachi 1:6-14 suggests that the priests are not honoring God by accepting blemished animals as sacrifices. This raises the question of whether the people should continue to tithe if the priests are not fulfilling their responsibilities. The nature of God's love. Malachi 1:2-3 suggests that God loved Jacob and hated Esau, but Malachi 2:16 suggests that God hates divorce. This raises the question of whether God's love is conditional or unconditional. The role of priests. Malachi 2:7-9 suggests that priests should be faithful teachers of the law, but Malachi 2:1-2 suggests that priests are not honoring God by offering defiled sacrifices. This raises the question of whether the priests are fulfilling their responsibilities as mediators between God and the people. Contradictions in the Book of Zechariah. The Book of Zechariah, like many other books in the Bible, has some contradictions that scholars have debated for centuries. Some of the contradictions include the identity of the speaker. In some parts of the book, it is unclear who is speaking, whether it is Zechariah or God himself. The date of composition. The book is said to have been written during the reign of Darius the Great, but some scholars argue that it was written at a later date. The role of Joshua. In some parts of the book, Joshua is mentioned as a priest, while in others, he is referred to as the high priest. The number of horses. In chapter 1, there are 4 horses, while in chapter 6, there are only 3 horses. The location of the vision. In chapter 5, the vision takes place in a house, while in chapter 6, it takes place in a valley. These contradictions have led to different interpretations of the book, and scholars continue to debate their significance. Contradictions in the Book of Haggai. The Book of Haggai is a short book in the Hebrew Bible that contains 4 messages from the prophet Haggai to the Jewish people who had returned from exile in Babylon and were rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. While there are no major contradictions in the book, there are a few minor discrepancies that scholars have noted. Date discrepancy. In Haggai 1:1, the prophet gives the date of his first message as the 2nd year of King Darius. However, in Haggai 2:1, he gives the date of his second message as the 21st day of the 7th month. The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai, saying, this date corresponds to the year 520 BCE, which is the 4th year of King Darius, not the 2nd year. Temple description. In Haggai 2:3-9, the prophet describes the glory of the second temple that the people are building, saying that it will be greater than the first temple built by Solomon. However, this seems to contradict the description of the second temple in the book of Ezra, which says that many of the older people who had seen the first temple wept when they saw the second temple because it was not as grand. Ezra 3:12-13. Leadership discrepancy. In Haggai 1:1, the prophet identifies Zerubbabel as the governor of Judah and Joshua as the high priest. However, in Ezra 5:1-2, it is Jeshua, a different spelling of Joshua, who is identified as the high priest, and Zerubbabel is not mentioned at all. These discrepancies are minor and do not affect the overall message of the book of Haggai, which is a call to the Jewish people to prioritize the rebuilding of the temple and to return to God. Contradictions in the book of Zephaniah. Some contradictions found in the book of Zephaniah. The date of Zephaniah's prophecy. In the first verse of the book, it is stated that Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of Josiah. However, in verse 4, it is suggested that the prophecy was given during the reign of Manasseh, who preceded Josiah. The scope of the judgment. In some verses, Zephaniah speaks of a judgment that will encompass all nations, while in others he focuses specifically on Judah and Jerusalem. The fate of Nineveh. Zephaniah prophesies that Nineveh will be destroyed, but this contradicts the historical fact that Nineveh was not destroyed until several decades after Zephaniah's time. The nature of God's wrath. Zephaniah portrays God's wrath as a violent and destructive force, but in other parts of the Old Testament, God's wrath is depicted as a more measured response to sin. The role of the remnant. Zephaniah speaks of a remnant of faithful people who will be spared from God's judgment, but it is unclear how this fits into the larger picture of the book's message. Contradictions in the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk is one of the prophetic books in the Old Testament. It contains a dialogue between the prophet Habakkuk and God, primarily focused on the issue of why God allows evil to exist and prosper. While the book is relatively short, there are still some contradictions present within it. The nature of God. In Habakkuk 1:13, the prophet asks, "Your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously?" This suggests that God is entirely pure and cannot tolerate evil, yet in Habakkuk 3:3-15, the prophet describes God as a warrior who goes out to battle and causes destruction. This seemingly contradicts the idea of God being entirely pure. The timing of God's actions. In Habakkuk 1:2-4, the prophet complains that God has not answered his prayers and has allowed evil to continue unchecked. However, in Habakkuk 2:3, God says that his vision will come at the appointed time and will not delay. This raises the question of why God has not acted sooner if he has the power to do so. The role of Babylon. Throughout the book, Babylon is portrayed as a wicked nation that God will eventually punish for its sins. However, in Habakkuk 1:6-11, God says that he will raise up the Babylonians to execute his judgment on Judah. This seems to contradict the idea of God punishing Babylon for its sins if he is using them as a tool to punish Judah. These contradictions are not unique to Habakkuk but are present in many other books of the Bible. They can be explained through various interpretations and theological perspectives. Contradictions in the Book of Nahum. Some contradictions that scholars have identified in the Book of Nahum. Timeframe. The Book of Nahum mentions the fall of Nineveh, but the timeframe in which it occurred is unclear. Some scholars believe that it took place around 612 BC, while others believe it happened much earlier. Authorship. The author of the Book of Nahum is unknown, and there is no consensus among scholars about who wrote it. Some suggest that it was Nahum himself, while others believe that it was written by someone else. Theological views. The Book of Nahum portrays God as a vengeful and wrathful deity who punishes his enemies. This view contradicts the portrayal of God in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, where God is described as merciful and forgiving. Historical accuracy. Some scholars argue that the Book of Nahum is not historically accurate, as it contains several exaggerations and inaccuracies. For example, the book suggests that the Assyrians were completely destroyed, which is not true. Literary style. The Book of Nahum is written in a poetic and prophetic style, which makes it difficult to interpret. Some scholars argue that the book contains metaphorical language and should not be taken literally. Contradictions in the Book of Micah. Contradictions in the Book of Micah. Date of Micah's prophecy. The first verse of Micah indicates that he prophesied during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. However, some scholars argue that certain sections of the book reflect a later period, possibly after the Babylonian exile. Micah's origin. Micah is identified as a resident of Moresheth in chapter 1, verse 1. However, in chapter 1, verse 14, he speaks of being taken captive to Lachish, which is in Judah. This raises questions about his actual place of origin. The fate of Jerusalem. In chapter 3, Micah prophesies that Jerusalem will be destroyed and the Temple Mount will become a wooded hill. However, in chapter 4, he prophesies that in the last days, Jerusalem will become the center of worship and all nations will come to it. Conquest of Assyria. In chapter 5, Micah prophesies that Jerusalem will be delivered from the Assyrian army. However, in chapter 7, he speaks of the city being surrounded by enemies and its inhabitants being taken captive. These contradictions have led some scholars to suggest that the Book of Micah may have been written by multiple authors or compiled from different sources. Contradictions in the Book of Jonah. The contradictions that are commonly discussed in the Book of Jonah. Jonah's initial disobedience. In the beginning, Jonah disobeys God's command to go to Nineveh and instead boards a ship heading in the opposite direction. This contradicts his later willingness to go to Nineveh and preach. The nature of God. In Jonah 4:2, Jonah complains that he knew God would be gracious and compassionate and slow to anger, but in Jonah 1:2, God is depicted as being quick to anger and ready to punish. The repentance of Nineveh. In Jonah 3:5-10, the people of Nineveh repent and turn away from their wickedness, causing God to spare them from destruction. However, in Jonah 4:1-3, Jonah is angry with God for showing mercy to Nineveh, indicating that he wanted them to be destroyed. The plant. In Jonah 4:6-7, God causes a plant to grow and provide shade for Jonah, but then causes it to wither and die the next day. This seems to contradict God's earlier mercy towards Nineveh and his desire to spare them from destruction. These contradictions have led some scholars to suggest that the Book of Jonah was composed from different sources or traditions, or that it is a satirical work meant to challenge the reader's assumptions about God and human behavior. Contradictions in the Book of Amos. The contradictions found in the book of Amos. The first contradiction is regarding the date of Amos prophesying. In Amos 1:1, it is mentioned that he prophesied during the reigns of Uzziah in Judah and Jeroboam II in Israel. However, in Amos 7:10-17, it is said that he prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam II, which contradicts the earlier statement. In Amos 7:1-6, Amos sees a vision of locusts destroying the land, and then a vision of fire devouring the land. Later, in Amos 9:1-4, he sees a vision of God standing beside the altar and destroying the pillars of the temple with a sword. These visions seem to contradict each other, as they depict different forms of destruction. In Amos 5:21-24, God speaks through Amos and says that he hates the Israelites' religious festivals and sacrifices. However, in other parts of the Old Testament, God commands the Israelites to observe religious festivals and make sacrifices. This seems to contradict God's earlier commands in the Old Testament. In Amos 9:11-15, God promises to restore the fortunes of Israel and rebuild their cities. However, in Amos 5:4-5, Amos says that the Israelites will not be able to return to their cities. This seems to contradict God's earlier promise of restoration. These are some of the contradictions found in the book of Amos. However, scholars have different interpretations and perspectives on these contradictions. Contradictions in the book of Joel. The book of Joel is a prophetic book in the Old Testament of the Bible. Some scholars have pointed out contradictions and inconsistencies in the book. Here are a few examples. The identity of the invading army. In Joel 1:4, an invading army is described as a swarm of locusts that destroys the crops and vegetation. However, in Joel 2:1-11, the locusts are described as an army of human soldiers. This sudden shift in the identity of the invading force has puzzled scholars. The timing of the prophecy. The book of Joel does not provide a clear historical context or time frame for the prophecy. Some scholars believe that the prophecy was fulfilled during the Babylonian exile, while others argue that it refers to events that have not yet occurred. The nature of God's judgment. In Joel 2:13, the prophet urges the people to repent and turn to God, who is described as gracious and merciful. However, in Joel 2:31, God's judgment is described as terrible and great. This contrast between God's mercy and judgment has led some scholars to question the coherence of the book's message. The role of Jerusalem. In Joel 2:32, Jerusalem is described as a place of refuge and salvation for those who call on the name of the Lord. However, in Joel 3:1-2, Jerusalem is depicted as a city that will be judged and punished for its sins. This inconsistency has led some scholars to question the book's message and purpose. Contradictions in the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea is a prophetic book in the Old Testament of the Bible. It is believed to have been written by the prophet Hosea in the 8th century BCE. Some scholars have pointed out potential contradictions within the text, including the portrayal of God. In some parts of the book, God is portrayed as a loving and forgiving deity who wants to restore the relationship between himself and his people. In other parts, however, God is depicted as angry and vengeful, punishing his people for their sins. The timeline. The book seems to jump back and forth between different time periods, making it difficult to establish a clear chronological order of events. The message of salvation. The book contains both messages of salvation and messages of judgment, leaving some readers confused about the ultimate message of the text. The use of metaphor. Hosea often uses metaphorical language to describe the relationship between God and his people, which can be difficult to interpret and understand. Despite these potential contradictions, the book of Hosea is still considered to be an important and meaningful text for many people of faith. Contradictions in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel in the Bible contains several apparent contradictions, including historical inaccuracies. The book mentions that Nebuchadnezzar was the father of Belshazzar, but historical records show that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. Time discrepancies. The book mentions that Daniel served under several Babylonian kings, including Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius the Mede. However, historical records show that Darius the Mede did not exist and that the Persian conquering of Babylon occurred under Cyrus the Great. Narrative differences. The book contains two different creation accounts, one in chapter 1 and another in chapter 2, which differ in their details. Inconsistencies in prophecy. Some of the prophecies in the book, such as the prediction of the end of the world, have not come true, leading to questions about their accuracy. These contradictions have led some scholars to question the authenticity and reliability of the book of Daniel. However, others argue that the book was written in a symbolic and allegorical style, meant to convey spiritual truths rather than historical accuracy. Contradictions in the book of Ezekiel. There are several contradictions found in the book of Ezekiel, including The date of Ezekiel's vision. In the first chapter of the book, Ezekiel states that he saw his vision in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. However, in later chapters, he refers to the 6th year of the captivity as the time when he received his vision. The number of cherubim. In chapter 1, Ezekiel describes seeing 4 cherubim in his vision. However, in chapter 10, he describes seeing only 2 cherubim. The length of the siege of Tyre. In chapter 26, Ezekiel prophesies that Nebuchadnezzar will conquer Tyre and that the city will be destroyed. However, in chapter 29, he states that the siege of Tyre lasted only 13 years and that the city was not completely destroyed. The fate of Egypt. In chapter 29, Ezekiel prophesies that Egypt will be destroyed and that its people will be scattered. However, in chapter 30, he states that Egypt will be restored and that its people will be brought back to their homeland. These contradictions have been the subject of much debate among biblical scholars, with some suggesting that they are the result of different authors or editors working on the book over time. Others argue that they are simply the result of errors or inconsistencies in the text. Contradictions in the Book of Lamentations. The contradictions found in the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is a collection of poetic and emotional expressions of grief over the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC. It is traditionally attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. Some of the contradictions found in the book include: God is portrayed as both a loving and compassionate God who punishes Israel for its sins. In Lamentations 3:22-23, it says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness." However, in Lamentations 2:1-22, God is depicted as the one who brought destruction and devastation upon Jerusalem. The author of Lamentations expresses both hopelessness and hope for the future. In Lamentations 3:18-21, the author says, "I have been deprived of peace, I have forgotten what prosperity is. So, I say, my splendor is gone and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me." But in Lamentations 3:24-26, the author expresses hope in God's mercy and salvation. The book contains both individual and corporate laments. Some passages speak of the suffering of individuals, while others describe the suffering of the entire community. For example, Lamentations 1:1-11 describes the city of Jerusalem as a desolate widow, while Lamentations 3:1-21 expresses the personal anguish of the author. Despite these contradictions, the Book of Lamentations remains a powerful expression of grief and hope in the midst of suffering. Contradictions in the Book of Jeremiah. The Book of Jeremiah, like many ancient texts, has some apparent contradictions. Here are a few examples. Jeremiah's age. In Jeremiah 1:2, it says that Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry in the 13th year of King Josiah's reign. However, in Jeremiah 25:3, it says that Jeremiah had been prophesying for 23 years, which would mean he began prophesying during the reign of King Jehoiakim, not Josiah. Babylonian invasion. In Jeremiah 32:3-5, it says that King Zedekiah of Judah had already been taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon before Jeremiah bought a field in Anathoth. However, in Jeremiah 39:1-2, it says that Nebuchadnezzar did not capture Jerusalem until after Jeremiah had been released from prison. Jeremiah's death. In Jeremiah 52:31-34, it says that King Evil-Merodach of Babylon released Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, from prison and treated him kindly for the rest of his life. However, in Jeremiah 52:11, it says that Jehoiakim was still in prison when King Zedekiah was captured and taken to Babylon, and there is no mention of his release. These apparent contradictions may be due to different sources and traditions that were combined to create the Book of Jeremiah. Additionally, the text has been transmitted and translated over many centuries, which may have led to errors and inconsistencies. Nevertheless, the Book of Jeremiah remains an important part of the Hebrew Bible and has influenced Jewish and Christian theology and ethics for thousands of years. Contradictions in the Book of Isaiah. Some of the contradictions found in the Book of Isaiah according to biblical scholars and researchers. Authorship. The Book of Isaiah is attributed to the prophet Isaiah, who lived in the 8th century BCE. However, many scholars believe that the book was written by multiple authors, including Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah, who lived in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, respectively. Historical accuracy. Some of the historical events described in the book of Isaiah are contradictory to other historical records, such as the reign of King Sennacherib of Assyria. Messianic prophecies. The book of Isaiah contains several prophecies about the coming of a Messiah, but the descriptions of this figure differ greatly between different sections of the book. Theology. The book of Isaiah contains several theological contradictions, such as the concept of God's justice and mercy. Some sections of the book portray God as a vengeful and punishing figure, while others emphasize God's mercy and forgiveness. Eschatology. The book of Isaiah contains several prophecies about the end of the world, but these prophecies are often contradictory and difficult to interpret. Overall, the book of Isaiah is a complex and challenging text that contains numerous contradictions and inconsistencies. However, these contradictions do not necessarily detract from the book's spiritual and religious significance for many believers. Contradictions in the Book of Song of Solomon. The Book of Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs, is a collection of love poems between a man and a woman. Some scholars have noted several contradictions within the text, including the woman's appearance. In Song of Solomon 1:6, the woman says, "Do not stare at me because I am dark." However, in Song of Solomon 6:10, the man says, "Who is this that appears like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun?" This has led some to question whether the woman is actually dark-skinned or fair-skinned. The woman's identity. In Song of Solomon 1:5, the woman says, "I am black but lovely." However, in Song of Solomon 6:13, the man says, "Return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon you." This has led some to question whether the woman is actually named Shulamite or if this is just an endearment. The woman's fidelity. In Song of Solomon 2:7, the woman says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires." However, in Song of Solomon 5:2, the woman says, "I slept but my heart was awake. Listen. My beloved is knocking." This has led some to question whether the woman is faithful to her beloved or if she is tempted by others. It is important to note that these contradictions do not necessarily indicate flaws in the text, but rather reflect the complexity and depth of the love between the man and the woman. Contradictions in the book of Ecclesiastes. Some contradictions that have been identified in the book of Ecclesiastes. The author of Ecclesiastes seems to contradict himself regarding the value of wisdom. In some verses, he praises wisdom and knowledge, while in others, he claims that wisdom is meaningless and only leads to grief and frustration. The book also contradicts itself regarding the afterlife. In some verses, the author suggests that there is no afterlife and that death is final, while in others, he implies that the righteous will be rewarded in the afterlife. The author also seems to contradict himself regarding the nature of God. In some verses, he portrays God as just and sovereign, while in others, he suggests that God is distant and uninvolved in the affairs of humanity. Finally, the book contains contradictions regarding the purpose of life. In some verses, the author suggests that life is meaningless and that all our efforts are in vain, while in others, he encourages us to enjoy life and find happiness in our work and relationships. Contradictions in the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs in the Bible is a collection of wise sayings and teachings that offer guidance for living a good and righteous life. However, there are some contradictions within the book that can be difficult to reconcile. For example, wealth and poverty. Proverbs 10:15 states that the wealth of the rich is their fortified city, while Proverbs 10:16 says that the wages of the righteous lead to life, the earnings of the wicked are sin and death. These two verses seem to suggest that wealth is both a blessing and a curse. Justice and mercy. Proverbs 21:15 states that when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous but terror to evildoers, while Proverbs 28:13 says that whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. These two verses seem to suggest that justice and mercy are both important, but they may conflict with each other. Wisdom and foolishness. Proverbs 26:4-5 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." These two verses seem to contradict each other, as one advises against engaging with a foolish person, while the other advises doing so. Overall, the book of Proverbs offers valuable insights into how to live a good and righteous life, but it is important to consider the context and message of each verse, as there may be contradictions or inconsistencies within the text. Contradictions in the book of Psalms. Some contradictions that have been identified in the book of Psalms by scholars and critics. Theological contradictions. Some Psalms express a belief in a loving and merciful God who forgives sins, while others depict a harsh and vengeful God who punishes sinners. Historical contradictions. Some Psalms refer to events in Israel's history, such as the Exodus and the reign of King David, while others seem to describe a more idealized version of Israel's past. Literary contradictions. Some Psalms contain themes and language that are similar to other biblical books, such as Job and Proverbs, while others seem to be completely unique. Ethical contradictions. Some Psalms express a desire for revenge against enemies, while others advocate for forgiveness and love towards all people. It is important to note that these contradictions are often the result of different authors and contexts, and do not necessarily undermine the overall message and value of the Book of Psalms as a source of spiritual inspiration and reflection. Contradictions in the Book of Job. Some contradictions in the Book of Job. The introduction of the book states that Job is a righteous man who shuns evil, yet God allows Satan to afflict him with great suffering. Job's friends argue that his suffering is a punishment for his sins, but Job insists that he has done nothing wrong. God eventually appears to Job and claims to be just, but does not provide a satisfactory explanation for Job's suffering. The book concludes with God restoring Job's fortunes, but it is unclear whether this is a reward for his faith or simply a demonstration of God's power. Overall, the Book of Job presents a complex and challenging theological perspective, which raises many questions about the nature of suffering, the role of God in human affairs, and the limits of human understanding. Contradictions in the Book of Esther. Some contradictions that have been reported by scholars and experts in the Book of Esther. The timing of Esther's marriage to King Ahasuerus is unclear. In Esther 2:16, it states that Esther was taken to the king's palace in the 10th month of the 7th year of his reign, but later in Esther 3:7, it says that Haman cast lots in the 1st month of the 12th year of the king's reign. The historical accuracy of the events described in the book is disputed. There is no mention of Esther or Mordecai in any historical records outside of the book, and the details of the plot against the Jews seem unlikely to have occurred in the way described. The book contains elements of Persian culture and language that are not consistent with the time period in which the events are said to have taken place. For example, the use of the term satrap to describe the Persian governors is not historically accurate. The character of Esther is often seen as contradictory. She is portrayed as a brave and clever heroine who risks her life to save her people, but she also seems to be passive and submissive to the king's will, even when it conflicts with her own beliefs. The book contains several instances of violence and revenge, which seem to contradict the message of forgiveness and compassion that is emphasized in other parts of the Bible. Contradictions in the Book of Nehemiah. The Book of Nehemiah is a historical account of the reconstruction of the walls of Jerusalem and the restoration of the Jewish community after the Babylonian exile. As with any historical text, there may be contradictions or inconsistencies within the narrative. Some scholars have noted some contradictions within the book, such as chronology. The order of events in the book is not always clear, and some events seem to be out of order. Number of exiles. Nehemiah 7:66 and Ezra 2:64 give different numbers for the exiles who returned to Jerusalem. Temple finances. Nehemiah 10:34 and Nehemiah 12:44-47 have different accounts of the financial arrangements for the temple. Sabbath observance. Nehemiah 10:31 and Nehemiah 13:15-22 contradict each other regarding the observance of the Sabbath. However, these contradictions are not considered to be major or significant enough to undermine the overall historical accuracy and message of the book. Contradictions in the Book of Ezra. Some information about contradictions in the Book of Ezra. The Book of Ezra is a historical book in the Old Testament that tells the story of the return of the exiled Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. Some of the contradictions in this book include the number of exiles who returned. In Ezra 2:64, the total number of those who returned from Babylon is given as 42,360, while in Nehemiah 7:66, the total number is given as 31,089. The genealogy of Ezra. In Ezra 7:1-5, Ezra is said to be a descendant of Aaron, the high priest, but in Nehemiah 12:10-11, he is said to be a descendant of Sariah, the high priest. The order of events. The Book of Ezra presents events in a different order than the Book of Nehemiah. For example, in Ezra 9-10, Ezra deals with the issue of intermarriage with foreign women, while in Nehemiah 13, Nehemiah deals with the same issue. The identity of the Persian king. In Ezra 4:6, the adversaries of the Jews write to Artaxerxes, while in Ezra 7:1, Ezra goes to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Some scholars believe that this is a contradiction because Artaxerxes was not the king during the time of Ezra's return. Overall, these contradictions in the Book of Ezra have been a topic of discussion and debate among scholars for centuries. Some scholars believe that these inconsistencies are due to errors made during the transmission of the text, while others believe that they are intentional and serve a theological purpose. Contradictions in the Book of 2 Chronicles. Some contradictions that have been identified in the Book of 2 Chronicles. The reign of Ahaziah. In 2 Chronicles 22:2, Ahaziah was 42 years old when he became king, but in 2 Kings 8:26, he was only 22 years old. The number of chariots, in 2 Chronicles 1:17, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariots and horses, but in 1 Kings 4:26, he had 12,000 stalls. The length of reign of Jehoiakim, in 2 Chronicles 36:9, Jehoiakim reigned for 3 months, but in 2 Kings 24:8, he reigned for 3 months and 10 days. The death of Ahab, in 2 Chronicles 18:33, Ahab was killed by a random arrow, but in 1 Kings 22:34, he was killed by an arrow that was shot by a Syrian archer. The number of soldiers, in 2 Chronicles 13:3, Abijah had an army of 400,000 soldiers, but in 1 Kings 15:20, he had only 800,000 soldiers. These contradictions have been debated by scholars and theologians for centuries, with some arguing that they are transcription errors or differences in interpretation, while others see them as evidence of different sources or traditions being woven together in the text. Contradictions in the Book of 1 Chronicles. Some of the contradictions that scholars have found in the Book of 1 Chronicles. The genealogies in 1 Chronicles 1-9 differ from those in other books of the Bible, such as Genesis and Exodus. Some names are missing or changed, making it difficult to reconcile the two accounts. In 1 Chronicles 21:1, it says that Satan incited David to take a census of Israel. However, in 2 Samuel 24:1, it says that God incited David to do so. This is a contradiction in the cause of David's actions. The number of soldiers recorded in 1 Chronicles 21:5 and 2 Samuel 24:9 differ. 1 Chronicles records 1.1 million soldiers, while 2 Samuel records 800,000. In 1 Chronicles 3:19-24, the genealogy of Zerubbabel's descendants is listed, but in Ezra 3:2, it says that Zerubbabel was the only one who returned from Babylon. This creates a contradiction in the number of people who returned from exile. In 1 Chronicles 16:7-36, it records David's psalm of thanksgiving after the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Jerusalem. However, in Psalm 105, it is attributed to an anonymous author. This raises questions about the authorship of the psalm. Contradictions in the Book of 2 Kings. Contradictions in the Book of 2 Kings. Date of King Ahaziah's reign. In 2 Kings 8:25, it is stated that King Ahaziah began his reign in the 12th year of Joram, king of Israel. However, in 2 Kings 9:29, it is stated that he began his reign in the 11th year of Joram. Age of Jehoiakim. In 2 Kings 24:8, it is stated that Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king of Judah. However, in 2 Chronicles 36:9, it is stated that he was 8 years old. Siege of Jerusalem. In 2 Kings 24:10-11, it is stated that Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem in the 9th year of the reign of Jehoiakim. However, in 2 Kings 25:1, it is stated that the siege took place in the 10th year of his reign. Number of men in Israel's army. In 2 Kings 24:16, it is stated that Nebuchadnezzar took away all the men of valor from Jerusalem, leaving none behind except the poorest people of the land. However, in 2 Kings 25:19, it is stated that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. These contradictions have been pointed out by scholars and are considered to be discrepancies in the text. However, it is important to note that these discrepancies do not necessarily undermine the overall message and purpose of the Book of 2 Kings. Contradictions in the Book of 1 Kings. Some of the contradictions found in the Book of 1 Kings, which are as follows. The length of Solomon's reign. 1 Kings 11:42 states that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years, while 2 Chronicles 9:30 says that he reigned for 50 years. The number of Bathsheba's sons. 1 Kings 1:6 mentions that Bathsheba had only one son, Adonijah, while 2 Samuel 5:14 and 1 Chronicles 3:5 mention 4 other sons. The location of the Ark of the Covenant. 1 Kings 8:6-9 claims that the Ark was placed in the Holy of Holies in the Temple in Jerusalem, while 2 Chronicles 35:3 says that King Josiah moved the Ark from the Temple to a chamber in the house of God. The number of chariots and horses owned by Solomon. 1 Kings 4:26 states that Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses and 12,000 horsemen, while 2 Chronicles 9:25 states that he had 4,000 stalls and 12,000 horsemen. The date of the construction of the temple. 1 Kings 6:1 indicates that the temple was built 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt, while 2 Chronicles 3:1 says that it was built in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. These are just a few examples of the contradictions found in the Book of 1 Kings. Many scholars and theologians have debated and discussed these inconsistencies for centuries. Contradictions in the Book of 2 Samuel. Some examples of contradictions found in the Book of 2 Samuel, as requested. The number of years David reigned. In 2 Samuel 5:4, it states that David reigned for 40 years, but in 1 Kings 2:11, it says that David reigned for 33 years. Who killed Saul? In 2 Samuel 1:10, an Amalekite claims that he killed Saul, but in 1 Samuel 31:4, it says that Saul fell on his own sword and died by suicide. The census, in 2 Samuel 24:1, it says that God instructed David to take a census of Israel, but in 1 Chronicles 21:1, it says that Satan incited David to take the census. The number of chariots, in 2 Samuel 8:4, it says that David captured 1,000 chariots, but in 1 Chronicles 18:4, it says that he captured 7,000 chariots. These are just a few examples of contradictions found in the book of 2 Samuel. It is worth noting that different translations and interpretations of the Bible may address these contradictions differently. Contradictions in the book of 1 Samuel. Some of the contradictions found in the book of 1 Samuel. Here are some examples. In 1 Samuel 16:23, David is brought to Saul to play the harp, but in 1 Samuel 17:15, he is sent back home to tend his father's sheep. In 1 Samuel 31:4, Saul falls on his own sword and dies by his own hand, but in 2 Samuel 1:10, an Amalekite claims to have killed Saul. In 1 Samuel 15:2-3, Saul is commanded to completely destroy the Amalekites, including their livestock, but in 1 Samuel 15:9, he spares the life of their king and keeps the best of the livestock. In 1 Samuel 16:18, David is described as a skilled musician who plays the harp, but in 1 Samuel 18:7, Saul is angered by the women singing that David has killed tens of thousands, implying that David is a warrior and not a musician. In 1 Samuel 17:50, David kills Goliath with a stone from his sling, but in 2 Samuel 21:19, Elhanan is said to have killed Goliath. Contradictions in the book of Ruth. Some of the most commonly discussed contradictions in the book of Ruth. Genealogy. The genealogy presented in the book of Ruth does not match with that presented in the book of Chronicles. Timeline. The timeline of the events in the book of Ruth is unclear, and there are discrepancies in the way the events are presented. Boaz's ancestry. There is a contradiction in the ancestry of Boaz. In Ruth 2:1, he is referred to as a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, but in Ruth 2:3, he is referred to as a kinsman redeemer from the clan of Naomi's husband. Redemption. The concept of redemption in the book of Ruth is not consistent with the laws of redemption presented in other parts of the Old Testament. Ruth's nationality. There is a discrepancy in Ruth's nationality. In Ruth 1:4, she is referred to as a Moabite, but in Ruth 2:10, she is referred to as a foreigner. It is important to note that some of these contradictions may be a result of different interpretations or translations of the text. Contradictions in the book of Judges. The book of Judges in the Bible contains several contradictions. The number of years of peace. Judges 3:30 describes 80 years of peace after the death of King Eglon, while Judges 5:31 suggests only 40 years of peace. The identity of the first judge. Judges 4:4 identifies Deborah as the first female judge, while Judges 3:9-11 suggests that Othniel was the first judge. The number of tribes that participated in the war against Benjamin. Judges 20:15-17 and 20:23 mention 400,000 men from Israel, while Judges 20:10 says that only 400,000 men from Israel and 26,700 men from Benjamin participated. The age of Jephthah's daughter. Judges 11:34 says that Jephthah's daughter was sacrificed after he made a vow to God, while Judges 11:39 suggests that she was only dedicated to God and lived a life of celibacy. These contradictions may be due to different authors, sources, or interpretations of the text.
Contradictions in the book of Joshua. The contradictions in the book of Joshua as noted by scholars and researchers. The number of conquests. In Joshua chapter 12, a list of 31 kings defeated by Joshua is given. However, in Joshua chapter 10 verses 41-42, it states that Joshua conquered all the kings and their lands in one campaign. The destruction of Jericho. In Joshua chapter 6 verse 21, it says that Joshua and his army destroyed Jericho and killed everyone in it. But in Joshua chapter 6 verses 22-25, it says that Rahab and her family were spared. The length of the conquest. In Joshua chapter 11 verse 18, it says that Joshua's conquest lasted a long time. But in Joshua chapter 14 verses 7-10, it says that Joshua was 40 years old when he spied out the land of Canaan, and he was 85 years old when the conquest was complete. The location of Ai. In Joshua chapter 7 verse 2, Ai is described as being close to Jericho. But in Joshua chapter 8 verse 9, it says that Ai was on the other side of Bethel. The fate of the Canaanites, in Joshua chapter 11 verses 14 to 15, it says that Joshua left some Canaanites alive in the land. But in Joshua chapter 10 verses 40 to 42, it says that Joshua completely destroyed all the Canaanites. These contradictions have led some scholars to question the historical accuracy of the book of Joshua and to view it as more of a theological narrative than a factual account. Contradictions in Deuteronomy. Some contradictions found in the book of Deuteronomy as per the analysis of biblical scholars and theologians. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 9, it says that God punishes the children for the sins of their parents, but in Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 16, it says that each person is responsible for their own sin. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 2 says that those who are born out of wedlock shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. But Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 8 says that descendants of certain foreign nations may enter the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 7 to 8 prohibits the eating of pork and shellfish, but in Deuteronomy chapter 12 verses 15 to 16, it says that people can eat any animal they want. In Deuteronomy chapter 20 verses 15 to 16, God commands the Israelites to completely destroy the inhabitants of the land they are conquering, but in Deuteronomy chapter 2 verses 26 to 29, God commands them not to harm the Moabites, Ammonites, or Edomites. These contradictions have been a subject of debate and interpretation among scholars and theologians for centuries.